G'day coppers, welcome back to the bush. In this episode of Lockie Hub's 4-wheel driving, we'll be replacing this stuffed CV boot that anyone can do with basic hand tools in your own driveway. So, let's get into it. So before we start ripping stuff apart, don't forget it needs to be safe to work on, and that means jack stands, not just jacks under the vehicle. I've also put the tyres that I've taken off under the sills of the vehicle in case the jack stand fails. I've chocked the back wheels. I've put the park brake on because we're working on the front wheels. And don't forget, if you're driving a full-time four-wheel drive, let's say like a 200 series Land Cruiser, make sure you lock the center differential. And if you don't understand why, click the link up above and it'll explain to you in short order. Anyway, we have to get this brake caliper off. There's a couple of bolts top and bottom, so let's get into that. I'm just using a hammer to give it a little bit of encouragement. Now with those two out, we should be able to remove the brake caliper assembly. And don't forget, once it's off, don't touch the brake pedal, otherwise you'll push the pads out and it'll push the pistons out as well. And we're going to secure this to the top using a couple of wire ties. Let's have a look from the other side now. Okay, so the next one we have to undo here is a CV nut. Now in this case, this one's a 32mm. Now if you don't have access to an impact like this, what I'd recommend you do is put the vehicle back on the ground with the wheel on it to get the weight on there, and then you can use a breaker bar and usually an extension pole on the end of your breaker bar to undo these nuts. There's a fair bit of tension in there. But I've got an impact. Now I know I'm not using an impact socket there, but if it makes you feel any better, leave a comment in the section down below and I'll paint it black. But other than that, let's get this nut off. And there will be a torque spec for it, so we'll have to look up the torque spec later. And we'll pop him aside. Next thing we want to do is remove this split pin here so we can disconnect the steering arm. So I'll flatten out this split pin. Now these are single-use items, so you don't use these twice. You pull it out and you throw it away and get another one. Now we can loosen him off. Now there's a taper that holds this in here, so we're going to need to break the taper. And I'll use one of these tools, it seems to be the easiest way. Especially once you put it in right side up, which is like that. You get your 19mm on the bottom here, and eventually it'll pop it with a giant bang. So just keep turning until she pops. So back on the left hand side again, we've got this line here which is the wheel speed sensor, and this line here being the brake line, and that's kind of getting in the way, so we're just going to undo that. Now with that out of the road, we've got clear access to this nut here and the one up above, which we'll have to remove this one and loosen this one. So let's start on that. Now the reason we're taking this one out and loosening off this one is so we can tilt the whole assembly, the brake rotor and everything up a bit so we can get the CV out. Yeah, these will be pretty tight, so a little bit of percussive help. So with that one now loosened, let's start on this one. Now just encourage it out. There we go. Now we've got that out, we can work on the bottom one. Now we're right underneath now, we need to remove this split pin. It depends on the design of it as to what's at the bottom here. This one has a split pin and a taper lock, which will no doubt be entertaining to get out. Righto, now we've got the split pin out. We'll grab our tie rod tool and put that in and see if we can encourage it out. Right after I remove the nut. That's going to help. Now I can get the tight rod tool onto it. It might actually come out now. Now with it on, let's see if we can crack it. And pop, there she goes. Now with our taper broken, we can pull the lower arm out. Then leave it out. We'll see if we can get this out. Usually just encourage it with a hammer. And after a fair bit of messing around, we've got the disc off. Okay, so now we've done this end, we have to disconnect it from the differential end. Okay, so this is the inner CV, and there is the differential there. So I've got a bit of a chisel here, and I'm going to move the camera, otherwise I'll end up with oil all over it. But you get a chisel in here, or a screwdriver or a lever or something, and you just push it a little bit, and you can push the CV out of the differential itself. So I'll do that now, and I'll show you once it's out anyway. Okay, so now comes time to remove the old CV boot. Now the easiest way I find to do it is with an angle grinder. You can cut them of course, but cut them with the angle grinder is pretty fast, so I'll just do that now. That's one, and I'll put it on a better angle so you can see what I'm doing for the other one. What we're going to do is slice this in half basically. And just wrangle them off. Now the easiest way to get the boot off, I found, is just to cut it off with a Stanley knife. So I'll grab my Stanley knife and you just cut from one end to the other. That last little bit. Here we go. Right, now you just peel it away. That's it. CV boot's off. We'll clean up the gunk out of it. Now to remove the CV itself from the drive shaft, I've cleaned out a bit of the grease here, as you can see. Now what we need to do is we need to simultaneously pull on the end of the CV and whack on there with a hammer. Now if you've got a brass hammer or brass drift, more power to you. I don't, so here we go. Rightio. And there's a little circlip in here that locks this in, which I'll show you in a minute when we're reassembling. Now it's time to get the actual CV boot and do the install with that. Okay, now comes time to reinstall the boot. But first up, we'll grab the clamps, 2 clamps, and we'll pop them on right up the end. Small one first, large one second. Reason for that will come apparent in a minute. And then we can slide the new boot over the top of the assembly and push him right back. It'll make it easiest for us in a second. So then grab your CV. Now you can clean it out with brake cleaner or whatever. I've got most of the gunk out. Your CV kit will come with grease, and what you need to do is you need to fill it up. But I'll save you watching that. I'll fast forward this bit. Now that circlip I was talking about before has 2 ends, and what you need to do is you need to start it into there, and you need to push the 2 ends in. And it's kind of hard to see through all this grease until you can feel them both lock in, and then you can push the CV home. Or it might need a gentle tap with a hammer. And you might have or might not have heard the click there, and that tells me that the circlip is now sprung out a little bit and she's fully seated. Then you grab the rest of your grease, because it's CV and they love grease, and put it all around there. Use the entire packet. Now with the last of the grease put in there, we can actually pull up the boot. And there'll be a little slot that the boot sits in on either end. Now for the bands, the fun part. So we'll do the larger of the 2 first. So it's usually a double wrap on this sort. There's 2 styles. The other style, the other main style, is the one we actually took off, where you need a different tool. Now you can do this with pliers and a screwdriver and a pair of tin snips, or you can purchase one of these and Bob's your uncle. The way you work with these CV band tools is you thread the end through like that, put him under the cutter, and then you put him onto the winding mechanism. Once you've got that all set up, a little bit through, line up your band, I really should get the grease off my hands before doing this. Ah, that'll do. Alright, so we've lined up the end of the boot there, and you just use this to put some tension onto the band. Now, not too much tension, otherwise you'll cut into the boot itself. And once you're happy with the tension, you bend him over to lock him off and then cut him off. That's it. We're left with that little bit up there. Now all we need to do is lock it down and neaten it up. So give me a bit of a peen here, and there's 2 in from the edges here. That's one end done, on with the other end. Righto, now to put the other band on, simply grab the end, slide it through. Then you need to put it around the little winch bit, windlass perhaps. Once you've got that through, just draw him through the back, line him up, then use the handle to put the tension on there. I think it might be better going that way. Now, not too much tension, otherwise you'll cut into the rubber. Once you're happy with the amount of tension, just bend him over, then use the other bar to cut him flush. Now with that done, we have to neaten up the edge. So we'll peen this edge over a little bit, till it's nice and flat. Then we've got the two parts coming in from each edge, two little tabs. So we just need to hold this flat and bend them over. Then we'll peen him flat again using the pin punch. That's it. Now we're ready to install it back in the vehicle. Now to reinstall the drive shaft, we have to pop it back up here, and you have to line up on the inside, which isn't the easiest job. The splines on the inside. Once you've got it there, sometimes you'll have to rotate him a little bit. There we go. And occasionally, once in a blue moon, it will just slide in and pop right in like it did then. And that's all my luck used up for the next millennia. Rightio. With that done, we can reassemble the rest of it, starting by putting the spline into the hub. It's almost starting to look like a drivetrain again. Okay, the next one is a couple of bolts down the bottom and then a bolt up the top. And I'll move the camera so you can have a decent look at that. For the lower ball joint on the lower control arm, we'll screw him down there. Now, I'm sure there's a torque spec for it, but I don't know what it is. And usually when you're putting through the pin on the castellated nut anyway, the torque spec goes out. So grunt and a half maybe, nice and tight. Now we've got that nice and tight. We'll have to keep adjusting it until we can see the hole for the split pin. That seems to line up there okay. So I'll just grab my split pin. Alright, so we'll just separate the two halves. Bend it back on itself. We'll shorten up this half a little bit. And we'll bend it back up the other side. Beauty. Bottom's done. Onto the steering arm. And now for the steering arm. So I zip tied that up out the road. So we'll just cut the zip tie. Take the bolt off. And reinstall it in the steering arm. And get that in as straight as you can. Then we can pop the bolt on the top. The nut, sorry. And we'll just tension it down. And again, that's going to require another split pin in it. So we line that up as best we can. Grab our split pin and see if it's even remotely close. And it is, first try. There you go, first time for everything. And just as before, take the top one over the top, bend him over. And we'll cut this one short. And now we'll just push this one down. Beautiful, job done. Now, I've already started this bolt here. So next we've got these two camber bolts there, part of the McPherson strut assembly, and we'll just tighten them up. And these are fairly big bolts, so grunt and a half. Right, and now for the bottom one. I need to put a nut on the other side though. And I'll just tighten him up too. Right, that's tight. A little bit of wiring on the other side now, so we'll spin around to the other side. Back on the front side of the car again. And we'll pop him in here. That's just to secure a bit of wiring. So again, this is the wheel speed sensor for the ABS system and traction control. And the other one's a brake line. And we'll just nip him down. Okay, only a couple more things to do, and one being the caliper for the brake, so we'll do that now. Okay, now for the brake caliper. We'll cut the zip tie that was holding it up to the spring there. And if no one's touched the brake pedal, it should pretty much flop back on. I do say pretty much. There we go. Didn't want to fight me too much after all. Okay, so we've got the two 17mm top and bottom. And we'll see if we can line up. At least the top is usually the easiest. Okay, so we've got them both started now. It's a matter of tightening it up. And the top one might only be able to get a spanner onto that. So I'll see if I'm winding him by hand. Okay, lucky last thing to do is the spindle nut. As is usually the way, it's the last nut that will give you the grief. And this one was no exemption. Murphy was out to get me today. But anyway, so the threads were a bit burred up and the nut wasn't going on cleanly. I thought it might have been the one from the other side, so I took that off and swapped them over. No, it was definitely the CV spindle, I suppose you'd call it, here. So instead of just putting the nut on there and sending it with Ugga Duggas, I actually got out a very fine file and cleaned up the threads. And I seem to have done a pretty good job. So I'll just send him home now. Okay, now that's all done. So last thing left to do, of course, is just to peen it, to lock it in. One that side and one on this side. And that's it, we're all over bar the shouting. Anyway guys, thanks for sticking around to the end. Now if you like this video, don't forget to give it a old thumbs up, and if you didn't, by all means, give it a thumbs down, twice. Thanks guys, see you in the next one. But I've got an impact, so I'm going to rip it off with the impact. Let's try that righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, eh?